Hi, everyone, and thanks for our panelists for joining. Um, Joining from my friend's house because our internet was out as well, and I'm having a new puppy, so maybe you'll hear some screaming in the background. But yeah, thanks for being here with us today. We're coming to the end of our TEK Talks. That's our second to last talk, probably. And we have a great panel here today. I'd like to acknowledge that here in Fairbanks, we're in the traditional lands of the Lower Tanana Dene, and our campus, UAF, is on Trathida. And in light of today's talk, I'd also like to acknowledge that research from a more Western standpoint has often been quite extractive with regards to Indigenous people and when done on Indigenous lands. And even though a lot has changed and is changing, and even though it might not have been us specifically that have operated in such a way, I want to acknowledge that we're still part of the system and that we're still operating in a system that is driven by the past. And so acknowledging that we are working in this context, I think helps us doing things better and differently. And so I would encourage everyone to read up on the specific past in the different regions, and just understanding that people have had different experiences, and we are all part of this and part of and situated in this context. And so with this, I'll hand it over to Margaret and to your panel. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining and for being here today.
Thank you. And so I'll be asking some questions, basic questions. But I think first I wanted to have the panelists introduce themselves. We'll start maybe with Jessica. You're first on my screen, so.
Yeah, thank you. Just going to share something really quick. Can you all see that? Um, okay, just very briefly, I wanted to share a couple of pictures with you. I won't read my screen, but I think what's really important here is Shojri Jessica Blackoji Gwachaje Gwatsan Ihli Ga Tanan Gwichi Shahan Marlene DeRochers Shiti Bill Black, Shitsi, Isaac John, Shitsu, Sarah John. I said, hello, my name is Jessica Black. I am Gwich'in from the village of Gwich'aje, Fort Yukon, and I live here in Tanan, Fairbanks. I am honored to live and work on the land of the Lower Tanana Dene, and I'm so grateful for their long-term stewardship on these beautiful lands. I wanted to just briefly say I introduced my parents and also my grandparents on the lower left if you're looking at the screen. And I would just like to say that all of the work that I do today is really because of them. They raised me very grounded in my Gwich'in culture. My dad's also a school teacher, so I felt like education has always been a part of my life, both in Western education and our traditional Gwich'in education. And so my focus in research is on governance and cultural protective factors, also centering equity work, but all because of my grandparents, how they raised me. I also am honored to work here at UAF in the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development, and also tribal governance, and co-lead several projects. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but just very thankful to be here. Thank you, Margaret, for the invitation. And I'm very honored to co-present with Professor Ramos and Evon Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Judy, did you want to go next? And did you want me to share your slides yet?
Oh, I could wait on my slides.
Okay.
So the Hutsu Hatuasa, Yekna Yahat, Yakat Kwani Yahat, Tiskohiri Yahat, Hati Yati Yahat, Tekwidi Dachkan. So my name is Judy Ramos. My Tlingit name is Dahutsu. I'm Raven Moiety from Yakutat, Alaska, Yakat Kwani Yahat. My father's peoples, the Coho Salmon people, my grandfather's peoples, the Brown Bear people from Yakutat. I'm also Indigenous work with the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development along with Jessica, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm working with, currently working out of Anchorage on traditional Dena'ina land. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Last but not least, Evon.
Shalaknai, Dr. Lindsay, Ninjajuk, Agonsagi, Gahia, Shoji Evon Peter Oji, Rushank, Owatanithli, Gatananguichi, University of Alaska Fairbanks, Kuchatguath, in Juk Drin, astronaut Ethli, headset Gehan. Shahan Adeline, I should T Ernest Raboff. I should see Stephen Sehot at Saul Peter Senior. I Chen should sue Catherine Peter Gavakwa. I wanted to introduce myself as well. I loved that Jessica started out speaking Gwich'in because, of course, I was understanding what she was saying. And if anyone else is a student of Gwich'in, they were understanding her as well. And I just think it's so important for us to normalize the use of our languages because they're the first languages of this land and this place, and introducing in a way that positions us in relationship to one another. And so I think the land acknowledgements and the use of our languages is just so important. My name is Evon Peter. I come from the village of Usharenko in English. It's Arctic village. I work here at UAF. I recently transitioned, as a few of you may know, from a position as a vice chancellor where I served for 6 years to a research scientist position at the Center for Alaska Native Health Research, where half-time, and the other half-time is I'm about to launch, and will become publicly announced next month, a Gwich'in language project, which I'm really excited about, which is at the intersection of language work, inclusive of research documentation, but also revitalization. And I also noted that today, due to my headphones, I am an astronaut. So just it's funnier in the context of the language, but just in case you registered a few English words in my introduction, that's what I was sharing. And I'm just really glad to be here today with the other panelists, and thank you all for organizing these talks. I've certainly enjoyed them, and I'm happy to be able to share a bit from my perspective today. Merci.
Thank you. So we developed kind of 3 questions to ask to start out with. The first one is, how do you do research with communities, your own and other Indigenous communities? And we're going to start out with Judy. Did you want me to share your slides?
Yeah, that I have a slides of the research project that I did with my community. So maybe if you can start sharing the slides. So I guess slide 2. So my research is really community-based with my own community, and basically the title is Yakutat Tlingit Seal Camps, investigating relationship among language, Indigenous knowledge, and glacier movement. But this is a collaborative research with an archaeologist from the Smithsonian, geologist Dan Mann from the University of Fairbanks. My mother was the senior researcher on there. She was representing the Alaska Native Science Commission, and I was a senior researcher working on my PhD. So the next slide. This partnership was funded through a National Science Foundation grant. And we collaborated quite a bit with the local community, which I did a lot of that collaboration. Forest Service provided a lot of the permits and provided the bulk bunkhouse, and were quite involved with helping us move all our people and gear up to our research sites. The city provided the landing craft to move all the gear around and storage facility between the years of the research project. I was working for the tribe, and we helped provide transportation and logistics My father was involved as the person that provided the inspiration for the research, and also his boat was used to move people around. My mother was a senior researcher. My brother also was boat operator, and I did a lot of the logistics and tribal support. And my son and daughter were both involved in the project. My son was a videographer. My daughter helped coordinate the local youth. So next slide. So my father, he was the one that provided the inspiration. He was a traditional hunter and one of the last persons that knew all the traditional knowledge on seal hunting. And he knew all the traditional sealing sites back 1,000 years, and he knew the names and location of the ancient seal camps. So we did interview all the fluent elders in the project and did mapping of places and names as part of the project. So next slide. So my research mainly was documenting the traditional knowledge, oral history, and place names. So these are some of the things that I interviewed the elders on, their techniques, the equipment, how they hunted, their traditional knowledge of hunting, their ways of processing the seal, and their traditional names for seal anatomy. So next slide. So when I was trying to define what is traditional knowledge, so this is my definition I was working off as traditional knowledge. It's transmitted and acquired over long periods, sometimes generations. Some aspects of Indigenous knowledge cannot be translated or observed. Spiritual aspects of Indigenous knowledge is not accepted by Western science, but is the basis for human interactions, animal interactions, in Indigenous societies. So Indigenous knowledge is based on their spiritual interactions with animals. And finally, some beings, like glaciers, have special treatment, beliefs, and rituals. So when we started the research off, my father led a blessing ceremony for the water and the glaciers, because we believed the glacier was a living being. And so we put some tobacco in the water for the glacier that when we were up there at the glacier. So next slide. So just an overview of some of the concerns that I observed over the project. And one of the concerns that the researchers, we had about researchers and people coming into the community without introductions, because a lot of time researchers just come into the village and they don't go around and they meet the people. So that was a concern. Also, disturbing the spirits, and we had a ceremony to put the spirits back to rest, because the sites where the archaeologists were investigating were ancient, maybe probably burial sites, and people were living there in the past, and we were concerned about the disturbing of the spirits. Also, we were concerned about researchers talking about spiritual, religious aspects without consulting the tribe. So that was a concern from the elders of researchers. We'd tell them something about maybe that was found, and then they would sort of acquire that knowledge and talk about it without really talking to the elders about that spiritual knowledge. And then also they were concerned about what happened to the artifacts and also the researcher after the project was finished. And next slide. And some general challenges we had was the researchers not understanding the local environment, the ice conditions and bears. One of the researchers' boat overturned in the water. When the ice started coming out, it fills up the whole bay, and his his boat overturned in the water up there. Also local accountability, ensuring local awareness, and also concern about doing research when people are busy in the summer doing subsistence gathering and not adhering, they demanding that they adhere to their research schedule and that the local communities needs to do subsistence gathering in the summer. But the next slide is the benefits, knowledge and expertise of the researchers, adding to the body of knowledge and comparing results from previous research. Information can be used in the future, and also that information we gathered can be used for archives, curriculum. So we had about over 70 interviews that were done during the process of this research. And then next slide. So for future planning, some suggestions that I came up with more local input into the planning before the project begins, developing an MOA. Publications should include the community, our elders and the tribe, and also discussing agreements on tribal, cultural, and intellectual property rights before the project is done, like who has ownership of the information. And next slide, that's a link to some of the publications. And then next slide, I just found out these, well, I wanted to share these really principles I thought were really, really good about research, working with communities, especially research that contributes to the community. It's conducted respectfully. And then knowledge for knowledge's sake is a waste of time. Relational accountability, respectful representation, respectful appropriation, and rights and regulation. And then last slide, is the next slide, is also she had other suggestions about differences between research done with Indigenous contexts using Western methodologies and research using Indigenous methodology. Accept and advocate Indigenous knowledge systems that might not conform to Western academic standards, positioning of community members and researcher, determine the agenda, who needs to consider the needs of the community, and directionality of sharing knowledge. So those are some really good suggestions that I read that might be useful for people doing research with communities. So thank you. Maybe I'll go ahead and turn it back to Margaret.
All right, thank you. And last, Evon.
I think I go next, Margaret.
Oh, right. Sorry.
It's okay. No worries. So, answering this question, how do you do research with communities, your own and other Indigenous communities? I think one thing that's really important that I have a lot of conversations with, sorry, I'm trying to find the share screen button, not the chat. Give me 1 second. So one thing that really comes about in conversations I have with colleagues and friends, and also people that I've just met, is how do you go about this in a good way? And people are usually familiar with community-based participatory research, which is really about a research approach that looks at research as equal partnerships between community members, organizational representatives, and researchers. And whenever I have these conversations, I think that's a really good starting place. And there's been a lot of work that's been done in this area. I wanted to share with you also just this model done by Wallerstein and Duran. And I'm not going to go through it because there's a lot going on here, but there is excellent resources out there just to get more in depth in what this really means. Because I think for many of the communities that I work with, my own and other Indigenous communities, there is a lot of recognition among my people and other Indigenous people of the harm that research has done in Indigenous communities historically and even present day. And so how do we do better research as scholars when we're engaging Indigenous communities and peoples? Well, one thing is we enter into communication, we share ideas, we have forums where we can share across disciplines and across knowledge systems. So, dialogues or conferences where we bring people together, where there's true equity in what's being shared. There's true collaboration, even in the or I shouldn't say even, importantly, with the development of a research question, what is needed in communities and how are communities being asked, or how is the communication coming across as to what needs to be studied? So community-based participatory research looks at the research process from developing the question throughout the research process and through evaluation. There is ongoing, meaningful participation, agency. Many times communities may decide to pull back because of what's happening in their own community, and that is perfectly fine because they're the ones that are the leaders in their community, and they know what's going on beyond the research process. So CBPR is a really good model to investigate. I also really enjoy what's coming out with tribally driven research. And the reason why this is really important is that tribes are sovereign governments. So they have a government to government relationship with the US federal government. So they're sovereign tribes. And it's really important to recognize that when engaging in the research process. Some of my colleagues or people that I meet will say, how do I go about contacting the community? I always recommend starting with the tribe, because the tribe as a government has the ability to drive what is coming out of tribally driven research is drive the research and really control the activities, and yes, enter into partnership if they want, but it's really up to them. So engaging with the tribal governments from the earliest stages is really important, and as well as empowering the tribes to do so and building capacity within. So some of our partners, they're working with young people to train them in the more Western science approaches to research. And that's great. That's reciprocity, right? That's giving something back, as we're engaging in the process of research, helping to train young scholars. But there's a lot being written in terms of tribally driven research, and I put a citation at the bottom. You can look at their work. They wrote a nice paper about tribally driven research. Oh, I'm going to stop there for now and just say that, so when working with my own community and also working with other Indigenous communities, that's the approach I really look at. Within one of the projects that I co-lead, Indigenizing Salmon Science and Management, we are working with community-based organizations that are already engaged in this type of work and really taking their lead as to what needs to be done, because they're on the ground. Like, there's no need for me to necessarily go into the community and conduct research when I have partners who are already from the region and can speak the language, know their community. They give us direction as researchers as to how we should proceed. Yes, all of this takes time. And I know time, the concept of time, is very different in a Western academic system than it is in an Indigenous community. But those are things we have to broker along the way in terms of engaging with Indigenous communities in the process of research. We have to slow down and really listen to what's being said and the direction we as researchers are being given. So I think I'm going to stop there for the sake of time and turn it over to Evon.
All right, I guess I'll just jump right in. Yeah, thank you for that handoff. And and opening. Both of you and Judy's comments really got me thinking about a lot of different things. One that I want to focus on is, and I know that some of this will segue actually into our next question as well. In particular, when we think about community-based participatory research, the framework that Jessica just covered is really an advanced notion of the local community driving the research questions and helping us to shape what it is that we're focusing on in work that is of importance and significance to the community itself. And both Jessica and I are involved in an NSF-funded project called Arctic Futures together through the Center for Alaskan Health Research, where we really are taking that approach to working with communities, engaging. And even though those communities are Gwich'in communities, where both Jessica and I come from, we're still researchers representing the university system in our role as researchers at the institution. And so we're not skipping by any of the really important steps in protocol and relationship as we engage within even our own communities. And so some of the work there, making presentation, educating the community, and in particular the tribal government of what it is that we're supported to do and how we hope to work with them, with the community defining for themselves areas that are important to them in the research that they're wanting to have conducted. I won't talk too much about that project, but I think that's a good juxtaposition to the other project that I want to speak a little bit to, that's also housed within CANHER at UAF, which is the Alaska Native Collaborative Hub on Research on Resilience. Jessica, again, is a partner with us in this effort, but I want to speak to, as a research institution, how we went about engaging and working with at multiple levels in the research project with the Indigenous community. In particular, this project is expansive to 60 some communities across the state. And so it wasn't, we weren't able to focus specifically in on just a singular community. And so as we built the layers of leadership within the project, we took that into consideration as we brought in folks to the research initiative. To begin, at the highest level in the research project, we have an internal leadership team, or ILT, that consists of 5 Alaska Native scholars, including faculty Jessica Ulrich from UAA, as well as Jessica Black here at UAF, myself, Charlene Apak, who's a doctoral student who's engaged in the project, and then we also have Stacy Rasmus, who is the director of her Center for Alaska Native Health Research and an Indigenous researcher herself as well, within that ILT team. And so as we thought about how we were going to approach the implementation of the project at the highest level, we had Alaska Native and Indigenous input at an equal peer level within the institution, helping us to shape our steps and approach. The next level is with our external advisory council, or EAC, which is a requirement of all the NIH grants. We chose to take a groundbreaking approach really on a national scale. And I think we're the only NIH funded project that has an EAC that has the constitution that we have, which is made up of 100% of Alaska Native membership. And we selected leaders from across the state because of the diversity of their background and experience in the tribal healthcare system, but also at community level leadership, tribal leadership, and regional leadership of Native leaders across the state, who we knew had their minds wrapped around the larger context and the specific areas of knowledge and expertise that were really important to help guide us as we approached, really from an ethical standpoint and perspective, the work that we're doing. And Jessica mentioned how important listening is, and our EAC certainly has provided really clear guidance to our ILT. In some cases, we had to slow down our project, as she said, or change course to course correct. And while that's really challenging for us as a research team and for the PIs, especially I think on the research project, we still recognized how important it was for us to take that step back, reevaluate, make some changes, make a pivot in some cases, and then move forward really in alignment with that guidance that we were receiving from the EAC. I know I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the 2 other layers I want to touch upon of integration within the Anchor project are at the research steering committee level. the research steering committee is made up of individuals, both Alaska Native and non-Alaska Native, that are from the regions where the research is being conducted. But they're all community members, and they're all engaged in the work at a community level, in this case around behavioral health, prevention, mental health. And so we were ensuring to have greater depth of engagement with, for example, shaping our AIM 1 goals for our research questions that we carried out in the first stage of the research project. And they provided really critical insight into how to word questions in a way that will be best understood by people at the community level within the villages. And that's just an example of the value of that input. And again, this takes a lot of dedication and time to host regular meetings, bringing a large group together, sharing with them and walking through the goals, the aims, and the steps that we need to take to conduct a research project. But then again, them being able to contribute and provide very real input to us that, again, changed the shape of many of the questions that we were asking, that we thought were great questions, of course, even though some of us are Alaska Native on the ILT. And so that extra added layer of that input, I think, was really critical. And the last thing I'll state that we engaged, which I think was also very dynamic attribute of the project, is when we conducted those first round of interviews, we utilized our undergraduate students in our Rural Human Services program, which is a program that trains village-based counselors in our villages. So these are folks that are living in the villages, working as counselors, and they were the ones who carried out and conducted the interviews within their regions and communities. And just some really incredible outcomes. One that I'll note here is that it provided the opportunity for example, in some cases, if an elder answered on the other side of the line to respond to the survey, they would recognize that the person had their same accent, and in one case said, "Hey, can we just conduct this interview in Yukdun, in our language?" And the interview happened to be fluent in the language as well, and said, "Yeah, sure, let's just switch over to Yupik and we'll just conduct interview." And you can imagine the added value and context to the response in that survey and those questions when an elder is able to speak in their first language and share concepts and understanding rooted in the knowledge, the local knowledge of the community. And so that, I think, the anchor projects, our effort at the time and currently underway to do the best we can as a research institution to really integrate at multiple levels and tiers Indigenous engagement, participation, and leadership. And it's serving two ways. It's helping, I think, our research project to be stronger and increase validity of our outcomes, but it's also providing this opportunity to increase capacity and awareness and understanding around how research can be a benefit within Alaska Native communities, within the community itself. And so I'll stop there with that overview.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are great examples. The next question was, how do you navigate being an Indigenous researcher? And this one will start out with Jessica.
Thank you. So, a lot of the work that I have really focused on is, and this kind of gets into the last question, but I'll keep it focused on navigating being an Indigenous researcher, is the recognition. I shared the picture of my grandparents, and I think many of us Indigenous scholars could share a lot of pictures of where we learned what we know and from who and how that relationship, like my grandparents learned from their parents and their grandparents, and it goes back to 14,000 plus years of Indigenous stewardship and care. So knowing that and really having that serve as such an important foundation for my life helped me to recognize that a lot of that knowledge wasn't reflected when I was going to school in Western academic institutions. In fact, during my PhD process, I felt like I did a lot of educating about what was happening in my homeland and the need for such a topic. And I had a very receptive committee. I went to school at Washington University in St. Louis, but I was doing a lot of the educating. And so there is this pattern of ongoing erasure, exclusion, and deep inequities that exist even in how we learn about Indigenous people and knowledge systems. I think we're making steps in the right direction as evidenced by just what we've shared, but there's a need to focus on shifting education research and governance to be more reflective. You know, Indigenous people are the first people of this land, Alaska, and UAF specifically is on Trathiadet campus, which is an Indigenous place. So how can we center Indigenous people, knowledge systems, and self-determination in our institutions? And there has been so much research really speaking to this. I added a few quotes here, and you'll have a copy of the slide, so I won't read them. But there's been research on how to not only include Indigenous knowledge and peoples in the process of educational and transformation reform or transformational education, but how to be a good ally in the process as non-Indigenous people. So, you know, as I walk in the academy, I'm always walking with my truest self, which is an Indigenous woman, and my culture and my grounding are always center in my heart. But I have to ensure that in these spaces, I bring that in and I advocate for the inclusion so my students don't have to. Because a lot of times they may, unless they're in an Indigenous program, which in the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development, we have a lot of Indigenous students, but in other programs, they're often the only ones. So I try to help bring or bridge the inequities and also transform systems so my students don't have to, and they can just show up as their full selves in welcoming spaces that allow them to not only learn what they don't know, but share what they know so well from this 14,000 plus years of Indigenous stewardship and care. I also have a definition of Indigenous knowledge very much aligned with Judy's that really looks at the holistic nature of knowledge, and that it is passed down and it is adaptive and spirituality being at the center. So really recognizing what it entails, but knowing that Indigenous knowledge is ever evolving as well. So it's not something you can just you know, have a brief definition of, because it's this ongoing long-term knowledge that's very holistic and place-based. So, you know, Margaret and I may have a very different definition just based on the way we are raised and where and how. So just wanted to share that. And I think I'll turn it over to Judy at this time and let her answer the question.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, when I first thought about this question, I started thinking about when I started doing TEK research for my tribe. I felt very much alone as a researcher, and I feel really sad for those researchers that they need peers in this field of research. There's not a lot of people doing that kind of research at the community level, so they need support. And I would, you know, find ways of mentoring and encouraging students, you know, to find people that can understand the kind of research they're doing. I was really validated when I first read Linda Tuhui Smith's book, and I just felt it's such an inspiration for my way of thinking that I came from the field of anthropology, and then just to read her book, I felt really validated that I don't have to do research or think about research from that point of view. I can take it from Indigenous point of view. And so it's really encouraging me to connect with other researchers, Indigenous researchers, and also when I do presentation, feel validated by the kind of method that I'm using. So those are just a few of my insights, but I really do like this because it just encourages Indigenous people to go ahead and continue to do research and feel supported. Thank you.
And then last but not least, Evon, if you wanted to.
Yeah, thanks. You know, how do we navigate as Indigenous researchers within the academy? You know, I actually want to also begin with the point both I think Judy brought up especially, which is the fact that, you know, all three of us are at UAF, and we have many other colleagues as Alaska Native faculty and researchers at UAF, and having somewhat of a critical mass to be able to lean on, to support each other and engage with one another, I think is just really important within the institution. As I was reflecting on this question, I really had a hard time imagining what it would be like if one of us was the only Indigenous researcher at their university, and not having that added support and context to be able to work with one another. And so I just want to begin by, I guess the feeling of gratefulness that I do have, that we're at the place that we're at within at UAF, and that my hope is that we continue to move in that direction and on that trajectory. But it is challenging. It's challenging being an Indigenous researcher in a highly Western institution. When I first came on board, for example, as a vice chancellor, one of the first talks I received was about how the academy is 1,000 years old and very rooted in protocol, tradition, ways of engaging and thinking, and bringing forward Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous wisdom, values, and systems into the context, of that very Western institution is challenging. And so how is it that we can continue to advocate and bring forward understanding around how we can approach things like in this TEK talk of engaging appropriately and in a right way with Indigenous communities? That how do we do that? So I think that really adds another layer of work that we carry as Indigenous scholars within the institution. Because we're not only needing to focus on our specific research projects and or teaching and other elements of service within our roles, but we're also simultaneously helping to uplift these other broader understandings. And I think going back to Judy's point about decolonizing methodologies, I remember when that was fresh off the print, I think it was like 1998, and getting my hands on that thing. And similarly, I was just so excited. It was so incredible to have an Indigenous researcher and scholar articulating some of the places that we need to push on within the context of academia. And I think that, that's the mantle that many of us have taken up and are working with as we're trying to help create more space for other Indigenous scholars and researchers and students, that are coming on board, and also to help transform the institution itself. And I was really lucky actually to have Linda on my graduate committee for a time. And so I got some of the added intensity of the kind of the guidance. And I think that's another thing, although we're not necessarily talking about that right now, but the importance of having mentors and having folks that are there to support us and provide some insight and input as we navigate some of the challenges that do arise within the context of the institution. And the last thing, to double back on a comment I made in the first question, is that even though we're Alaska Native and Indigenous and we're researchers within the university, doesn't mean that we're able to navigate any differently than other researchers when it comes to working within Indigenous communities, even our own communities that we go into. And so, all these protocols and frameworks of how we build reciprocity, how we build relationship, how we take the time to do all those things, I think is just important for us as it is for all of the other researchers at the institution.
Thank you. So the third question was, how do you push for transformation of universities, research institutions, things of that related sort, which I kind of feel like all of you guys already touched on, which I think speaks a lot to kind of the added pressure it is to be an Indigenous researcher. And so did you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, Margaret. I just wanted to share my slide really quick. Oh, I keep pushing the wrong button. Okay. I just wanted to say a transformation. These are pictures of some of my students and students that we've all worked with along the journey. And I just wanted to say that transformation really happens not only within some of the things that we've already shared, but with building relationships with the next generation of scholars. All of these students are already scholars in their own right. They've been raised within the context of their communities, by their elders, by their ancestors, and in relationship with the land, animals, and waters. And so transformation happens when we're able to value those students that are in our class or those people that are working on our research projects as their whole selves. And I think about what an honor it is to do this work and, you know, just get to know some of these amazing individuals and how awesome it is to learn about their communities, the way they were raised from their perspectives. And so when I'm thinking about transformation, you know, all of us can do that as we meet people, not only asking them about the project or how they're doing in class, but ask them to tell you about themselves and what they're passionate about, or how are you doing, you know, showing that respect across, you know, it's so hierarchical in academia. And so I think if we can just step back and really get to know the people that we interact with, not only at this academic level, but on a more personal level, we can learn a lot. So transformation is about, you know, building a cadre of, for me, Indigenous scholars and students so that we have a collective, and then also keeping my mind open to continually learning. That's one of the primary teachings that we receive as young Indigenous people, is that you're always learning and that you can learn from anyone or any being, the land, the animals, the water. So transformation really happens when we take a step back and we get to look at the world more holistically. And I just wanted to say thank you to some of my students for all that they've taught me. And I think that transformation happens when you open yourself to that possibility. So thank you.
Yeah, and I had a resource to share too. It's in Ray Barnhart wrote this paper in the role of Indigenous people in decision making. It's in North by 2010. And he said Indigenous people have to decide whether to accept, modify, or reconstruct institutional structures. And he laid out 10 range of possible engagement. And one is to, like, the lowest level is token recognition or non-native as an expert. But then if you go up to the next level, it's advisory level. Level 6 is coexisting. Number 7 is integrated system. And then number 8 is culturally based system. So that's self-determination on levels. But yeah, I found it really useful to check on his paper on the, you have to go beyond just not the non-native as an expert to, you know, this equal coexistence and self-determination levels. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in just with a couple kind of broad thoughts, and there's so many ways we could think about transformation, and I'm really glad the way Jessica and Judy began. I think about, you know, in institutional transformation, in particular in the framework that Judy just laid out as articulated by Ray Barnhart, I believe, is I think about in the context, for example, from an Alaska Native perspective, at one point in time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs governed and administered all programs that were intended for the benefit of Alaska Native people. And they did not do it very well. It was not a good time for Alaska Native people. Many of us even remember under the Indian healthcare system, you know, going to some of the clinics, and this IHS is a different system than the BIA system, Bureau of Indian Affairs, but neither of those systems were administered really that great. So with the advent of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which was federal legislation, it recognized that Indigenous peoples are the best position to administer and govern programs that are intended for the benefit of their own people and communities, because we know our communities best. And so that transformation happened not very easily. There was a lot of resistance, as you can imagine, within the bureaucracies of the BIA and the IHS to handing over that leadership and governance to, in this case here, Alaska Native people. But it did happen. And over time, the end result is a much higher quality of service that is coming to our people. And that's kind of like a transformation of a shift of handover in governance and leadership to our peoples in the context of self-determination. I think within the higher education context, we're looking at multiple layers of this conversation, not only higher education, but in education in general, from, you know, pre-K all the way up to PhD. we're really needing to look at, what makes sense to be handed over to in that framework of governance and leadership and self-determination to be managed and built by our own people, for our own people, but also for others. And there's a lot of work that would need to go into that, including curriculum development and lesson plan development that's rooted in Indigenous knowledge systems and languages and worldview. But then also in the higher education context, the importance of, especially institutions on our people's ancestral lands, really uplifting our Indigenous knowledge systems and pathways for our people to uplift those knowledge systems, as well as provide opportunities for Alaska Native and Indigenous student success within the institutions, and not only students, I should say, also faculty and staff success within the institutions as well. And so, there's a lot that I just laid out there, but I do think that when I think about transformation, I think about how do we do that? And I'm aware, for example, of at least one institution in Canada that has Indigenous elders from within their own community as a part of the doctoral committees. And I could imagine, as an Indigenous scholar, if I had to go up and present to Gwich'in elders from within my villages about to share some of the knowledge and understanding that I had, I would be much more intimidated than coming up against an academic committee of scholars within the Western institution only. But you can imagine the added dynamics and dimensions for those students who get to develop and pursue their doctorates within that framework, and how much more excitement there is around a deepening knowledge of their own language, culture, worldview, things that are important to their communities and to their futures. And so I think that, there's lots of different possibilities and pathways, but I do think that we need to continue to have that thinking around transformation in our mind and in the efforts and in the work that we're doing. And I think the Anchor project that I overviewed in the first question really is an act of working towards that transformation in a few different areas.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm hoping the speakers will be able to stay after a bit to answer questions. But I did want to say I did post evaluation form in the chat. Next week's talk is by Phil Wright, and about the knowledge, nature, and infrastructure of colonialism in Alaska. And so with that, we will open up for audience questions. And if you want, you can turn your cameras on at this point. So I've been asking you guys to keep them off. If you feel comfortable, you can turn them on. And I'll probably hand it over to Annika to kind of handle the questions.
Hi, yeah, thanks for speaking. And if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself, please go ahead. And otherwise, you can type it in the chat and I'll relay it to our panel.
Oh, right. We have a few phone people, and it's *6 to unmute if you're a phone person, or *6, *9 to raise your hand.
Hayo posted that he has a copy of Oscar Kawaki's book, if you're interested.
So no questions.
Margaret, I'll stick my email in the chat too.
We did get a question from Jennifer asking, how can non-native researchers work in these spaces, for example, tribal organizations, best support and help advance the effort for self-determined research? Sorry.
One thing that I think is really important is just getting to know communities. Jennifer, thank you for your question. Following up, presenting, I was thinking about, it seems like with my own community, in fact, in Fort Yukon, but also Arctic Village, where Evon's from, because my partner's from there, there's a lot of research that happens there, because it's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and outside of Fort Yukon is the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. And it seems like the non-native researchers that have spent a lot of time within the community continually have a really well-respected relationship, or they're well-respected because it's not just conditional based on the research. It's actually researchers who come to love and care for the community as, you know, sort of being adopted into the community because they love and care for the people as much as their, you know, project. I think that's really, I hate to put it in a crude way, but the relationship isn't transactional, right? It's really about relationality, respect, and reciprocity. And you find that those same researchers, they come back for gatherings, they offer to take pictures for auctions. I mean, there was just a lot of like love for the people, right? And so I think spending time is my point, because that's really crucial, and to build trust. Evon mentioned something really important about how as Indigenous researchers, we're not always just like, it's not just a shoe-in, right, to do research in our own community. We're sort of vetted by our own people, and it's because that trust has been lost along the way, and it needs to be rebuilt. So only time and you know, just sharing information. And I always say authenticity. That's the last thing I'll say, because people know, you know, and you're being real or not. And so I always say, when people ask me what I was doing, I just told them I'm here to collect my PhD research. They had known because I presented to the council, but I reminded them, and they asked me all kinds of questions, and I was like, oh, okay, you know. So I think just like those things are really helpful, and it helps to build trust so that people know that you're genuinely care. And then they're be asking you a lot of questions about your own research because they're excited about it, right? Because it's like something different. So those are just some things that I've experienced within my own community, but just also knowing from the elders, like how, oh, so-and-so is a really good person, because they always come back, you know, and they share, and you should talk with them. And it's like, you know, a non-native researcher who's been coming back for 20 years. So those are just some things I wanted to share.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing on that is, and that's that I think that having really close partners in the work that you're doing from within the tribes is just tremendously helpful. So whether they're culture bearers, knowledge holders, respected leaders at a community level, you know, having those folks to be able to, again, look to as for mentorship and for guidance as you take steps in doing the research to make sure that you're adhering to the local tribal protocols and practices, I think is a really critical approach for both your own learning, or our own learning, I should say, and also in maintaining that balance in the relationship with the community. So, and again, yeah, absolutely, it's longevity, I think, is really the key, and it's something that I don't think we could say enough. You know, if we're building research portfolios and projects, if we can focus our work in or around one or two communities and have longevity of relationship with those communities over duration of time, and I'm talking decades, then you're able to build that rapport, and your knowledge deepens over that time as well. And so it adds value to the research and the work that we're doing. So I guess those are just my added thoughts.
Hi, I had a question, and it came up when Judy was speaking. I'm not 100% sure how to articulate the question, but I was just thinking that you spoke about how you were recording the Indigenous knowledge within the area. And I'm wondering if that kind of recording is in some way distinctive from how information was shared in the past, and if that kind of interacts or comes as a conflict with how you relate to that knowledge in the past, if that interacts with your research in any way.
Well, there's benefits and there's contradictions. I think benefits is that we were recording some of the last fluent speakers of the language, so that language is documenting. But I always feel just that the sitting someone down and sticking the camera in front of them, you know, it's not the best method for me. Just I like that method of having tea and food. And so when my parents would come over, I would set out food for them, tea and crackers, and then I would record them, and that's the best way to do it. But the way of doing it from the Western perspective is sitting down and putting the lights on the camera and all things is not the best method, but it does at least record the information. So I think that's the best way, of course, is, you know, to do it in a very method that's very easygoing and just allow them to talk and not having a list of questions, but just allowing them to talk. Does that help?
Yeah, I'll add something here too. You know, just the Indigenous pedagogy ways of handing knowledge from generation to generation were disrupted with colonialism and assimilation practices. And, you know, when we think about the ways in which that knowledge was handed from generation to generation, oftentimes it was, again, over years of time on the land, because you had the time to be spending with uncles in an avunculate system where your uncle, for example, for a young man might be the one training him how to navigate on the land, learn all of the place names, how to read the stars, how to read the sky for weather. And when that system was disrupted, you know, naturally there began to be a cycle of a lot of loss. And especially when you had assimilation practices integrated with the oppression of our languages with the intent to eradicate them, for example. And so I think we find ourselves in a position now where it's critically important for us to use methods that weren't the traditional methods used, because we're not quite yet prepared to use them yet to be teaching the younger generations again until we've totally transformed our PK to 12 education system to reflect Indigenous pedagogies and knowledges and languages and so forth. So in this time, I think it's really important, critically important for us to be documenting our Indigenous knowledge, as Judy said, with our elders who are still first language speakers, who understand those knowledge systems, and to do the work. And that's the work of our generation and the generations to follow us, is to take that knowledge, that understanding, pursue it, and then shape it into the curriculum and the educational systems that our grandchildren will likely be going through, and maybe for some of us, our children will be going through. So as we rebuild and revitalize those foundations that are so important to our communities and people.
One more thing, I know we're out of time, but as just like a technical thing too, is just ask. That's the big thing. You know, do you mind if I record? Because I guarantee you cannot remember everything someone's told you, because there's just so much within it, right? Just like Judy and Evon shared. And just going back and transcribing my interviews for my PhD, I was just like, oh my gosh, it was just so enriching to listen to it all over again, and just so beautiful. And then offer to record it on something that they can share with their families, because especially for elders, most of the elders I work with, they want it recorded and they want to share it with their school, their grandchildren, so that this knowledge lives on, like Evon said. So, you know, that's the reciprocity piece of like giving it back to them in their community, because it's their knowledge, right? And so, but making it easy for them to access. So some of my elders, they like a CD player because they still listen to CDs, right? Whereas like younger people say, can you put it on a flash drive or something like that? So just making it accessible to them, because it's their knowledge and they want to share it with their community, and that's why they're doing everything that they're doing. So I always say, just ask them straight, and then they'll tell you. And if they don't want to, they'll let you know, or they'll say, don't put this part in the recording if it's something very personal, and you can actually take that out. So just some experiences I've had.
Thank you. We got another question from Craig asking, are there spaces available to Indigenous undergrad researchers to ask senior Indigenous researchers questions or to be mentored? I am wondering if there's a space where I, as an undergrad without an Indigenous research mentor, can be mentored or helped by an Indigenous researcher.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Evon.
I was just going to say, you know, depending on what your interests are and what you're wanting to focus on, offer to help. I mean, that's the way to enter into relationship. So in particular, like if you're here in the Fairbanks community, I'm not sure where you're located, but for example, if there's a tribal gathering or convening or potlatch happening at the tribal hall, you know, find somebody that you know or that you can begin to know and build a relationship with, and offer to help. And really just getting your hands on and contributing to within the community will help to build that relationship. And I think some of the best relationships that I know that non-Indigenous researchers have with Indigenous communities often began with them at a community level, helping out in some way or another. For example, I mean, they might have been hired because they had a master's in health, and so they could become a therapist at a community level. And so they began by providing a service and supporting within the community, and then maybe decided to then pursue a research pathway, and had already established those relationships. But as an undergrad, I would say that that's really a way to connect. And if you're at the Trothieta campus, there's probably ways for you to connect through Rural Student Services and some of the activities, or the Festival of Native Arts, for example, to begin to just build relationship.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to me as well. But creating those Indigenous spaces are really important, because if you're not part of a project or a major or like something, it may be hard to get to know where those spaces are. So feel free to reach out. I put my email in there, and be happy to connect you if it's not me.
And just kind of a follow-up, is there any online type places that you guys know of, like clubs are meeting online? Since it is COVID, it's probably especially hard to build relationships like this.
I did create a Facebook page called Indigenous Scholars and Like-Minded Individuals, and it's just a place to share information. And we have both Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants who are really interested in Indigenous knowledge, and we do job postings, and also when people publish articles, we share them. Or if somebody is a scholar and they're getting their PhD and they say, I want to, anybody have information on story as a method, people share resources. So it's called Indigenous Scholars and Like-Minded Individuals on Facebook.
Thanks. We did get a comment from Allison saying, thanks for mentioning sharing refreshments as an important element of collaborative processes. Note that many funding agencies have prohibited using federal funds for refreshments. It's a real problem that needs to be rethought by the agencies. So thanks for that comment, Allison. There are no more questions in the chat right now. So if you do want to ask a last question, please go ahead and do so. And thanks to our panel for staying a little longer.
Okay, I am going to stop the recording. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.